All right, it's 11:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you guys all for being here. I am so excited to be moderating this panel with Myah Ariel and Susie Dumond. My name is Regina Black.
Almost forgot.
Yeah, right. My real name is Regina Grosjean. I'm from Little Rock. I live here. I write romance as Regina Black, and my debut came out last year. It's called The Art of Scandal. But we're not talking about that today. We get to talk about these beautiful books that I got to read and love. I'm just going to introduce our authors. The first one is Myah Ariel. Myah Ariel is the author of the debut contemporary romance, When I Think of You, a second chance romance about a receptionist with a stalled filmmaking dreams, who must navigate a surprise reunion with her rising star movie director X, as they both confront her past and the pressures of Hollywood. Myah's early love of movies led her from Arkansas to New York City, where she earned a BA in cinema studies at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. She also holds an MA in specialized journalism for the arts from USC Annenberg. Did I say that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. For several years, Myah worked across multiple roles in film and entertainment before pivoting to work in academia. As a medical mom and a hopeless romantic, Myah is passionate about inclusive love stories. Thank you for being here, Myah.
Thank you.
Susie Dumond is a queer writer from Little Rock, Arkansas. Her latest book, Looking for a Sign, is a heartwarming sapphic romance about a newly single queer woman who moves to New Orleans and sets off a mission to find her most compatible match by going on a date with someone of each astrological sign. Susie is a senior contributor at Book Riot, where she writes a monthly horoscopes and book recommendations column, as well as various quizzes, book lists, and bookish news pieces. Susie received a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Tulsa and a Master of Arts in Public Policy and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies from George Washington University. Currently, she's probably making cupcakes at her home in Washington, D.C. with her partner, Mary, her dog, Waffles, and her cat, Maple. All right. Thank you for being here, Susie.
Thank you.
All right. Can we give a round of applause for our author? All right, so I'm going to dive in. I have a lot of questions and stuff for the author, so I'm going to dive right in and make sure you guys have plenty of time to ask questions as well. Can you both share, or I guess I'll start with you, Susie. Can you share the inspiration behind your book and just talk a little bit about how this story came to you?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I write horoscopes for Book Riot. I'm also just an astrology girly. So I've been in a relationship with my spouse for like 14 years. And it kind of occurred to me, like, I wouldn't even know how to approach dating now. And if I did, like, what would happen if I were to go on a date with one person of each sign? Like, what would that experience be like? In thinking about astrology and my love for astrology. And the idea just kind of burst forth from there, and it was really, really fun to write this like 12-date journey and try and keep it fresh with each different date, to think about how the signs would kind of come together and present themselves. I also wanted to approach it from a standpoint of somebody who, like, the main character doesn't really know anything about astrology, so that you don't have to know anything going into it. You don't have to like astrology. It's a fun journey, even if you think it's all bull. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, and I guess my inspiration starts from just the fact that since I was a wee child, I was always the hopeless romantic. Even if the movie or television show was not a romance, I was always most drawn to the love story aspect of it. Whether it was music or, music videos, R&B music from the 90s, I just have always gravitated towards romantic things. And so during the pandemic, like a lot of authors who have debuted in the last 2 years, I found myself drawn to reading a lot of romance novels. And I, like you mentioned, I went to film school, and moving from Arkansas to New York, it was just this very romantic idea, going to the big city. And this character, Kalia, who's the main character here, just sort of came to me after I had been inspired by romance for so long, read so many romance novels, and this character came to me, and I I just sort of had to get it down on the page. And so this story is inspired by my love of romance, also my love of movies, and yeah, that's basically the inspiration.
So fascinating. All right, so I read both of these books, and when I was reading them, the thing that really struck me was that you both have main women characters who are incredibly realistic and flawed and a little messy at times. And that was fascinating to me. How did you go about crafting those characters to kind of make them feel real and grounded and lovable despite their imperfections? And were there any challenges, like specific challenges that you had to balance when you were giving them these flaws, showing their growth, and then like their ultimate love story? So.
Sure. This might be a vulnerable answer, but as I was drafting this the first time and having people who read it and giving me feedback about this character, I started to realize that there was so much of me in this character. And you know, for better and for worse, I do, as a writer, I do want to reflect real people in my characters, not not sort of like ideals of a person. I want these people to feel fully fleshed out, three-dimensional, well-rounded. But as I was getting feedback, like, oh, this person's a little bit of a doormat. Oh, this person is kind of passive. And so as I was going back to kind of add some agency to Kalia and also Danny, it sort of felt like therapeutic to revise and build the character development. So that was kind of revelatory for me as an author, working through these characters. They kind of become people that you know, and the process for myself, seeing myself in the character is like became a growth process for me. So those are the kind of characters I like to read, and by product of that, the ones that I end up writing.
Yeah, I love that, and I do think there's something about writing a book that like is hard to avoid feeling a little like it's therapy sometimes, because you really do have to confront some of your own like thoughts that you don't really necessarily recognize, and you send it to your editor, and your editor's like, oh no, that's you need to take a second look at that, and you're like, oh, my character has to work some things, and that means I have to work through some things. But I think something that's great about romance is like the agreement we make with our authors is that like no matter what happens in the book, there's going to be a happy ending. That character's going to be taken care of, and they're going to find like a good life for themselves by the end of it. And there are romances out there where the main character is perfect in every way, and they, experience problems from outside of themselves, and that's great. I'm glad those books exist. But I personally really love a romance where the protagonist is kind of a bit of a mess, because those people deserve love and to find happiness and a chance to kind of like make some things right in their life too. I love Regina's book, The Art of Scandal, because it is very messy, and I love to see that in a romance. So I think that it's really adds to the journey for me, for the character to have flaws and to feel real. And if that character can be messy and mess up and still find love at the end of the book, then maybe the rest of us can too.
I love that. And speaking of love, your love interest for your main characters, how did you choose who this person would be, and like what made them the perfect person for these flawed, messy main characters?
So there were several things I wanted to do with this particular romance between Danny and Kalia, and one of them was I wanted to interrogate the concept of privilege. I wanted to have, this is a second chance romance where two people who got together when they were the right person, wrong time, and they needed to kind of grow into the people who could one day be right for each other. But they also come from the opposite sides of the track. Danny is a Nepo baby, for lack of a better term, and he is biracial, so he is still a person of color, but he has a proximity to whiteness that Kalia does not have. And they both have this passion for filmmaking, but he kind of has an open door because his father is a legend in the industry, and Kalia all she has going for her is her passion. And so I wanted to have this duality between the two of them where Danny has to get his privilege checked a couple of times because he doesn't understand that she doesn't have the privilege of not caring that the people in positions of power, feel about her a certain way, whereas he can walk into a room and just own the room. And so that plays a role not only in their professional dynamic, but also their romantic one. And so there's a little bit of a power dynamic there, and I thought that was really interesting as well. But also at the same time, he is still a biracial black man in Hollywood who has to kind of play the game too. So that was one of the important elements that I wanted to include in the story, and it's sort of a subtle way, not have it like on the surface, but have it kind of an undercurrent going throughout.
That's great. So I also I set up a really fun challenge for myself in this book because it was very important to me that a reader going into this book doesn't already know at the outset who she's going to end up with, which in most romances, like you read the marketing copy on the back and it tells you who they're going to end up with. And I really wanted readers to go into it and be rooting for their favorite signs and trying to figure it out with Gray, the lead. So I don't want to spoil for any of you who the romantic lead is in this book. I will say that I was guided somewhat, by astrology from the beginning. So I was thinking, like, my main character's an Aries. What works well with an Aries? But something that's interesting about that too is something that I do in all of my romance novels, which is that you want to find somebody who's like a nice balance for your protagonist. Somebody who looks at the world in a different way than they do, but like they have these things that they can come together in common over, and somebody who can teach them something new, but they can also teach that person something new. So that astrology is a fun tool to think about that, of how do people that are quite different balance each other in different ways. But I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it.
That's awesome. You actually touched on my next question with that answer, and it's about like this suspense in romance. So anyone that's familiar with romance knows that the one hard rule of the romance genre is that there is a happily ever after. The couple ends up together, and I've seen some people characterize that as a spoiler. Like, well, like, where's the suspense there? What is your response to that? Where is the suspense? Susie, you already touched on in your novel, you create suspense by, we know it's a romance. She ends up with someone. We know she ends up with someone, and the suspense is like, but who? Myah, could you touch on that in your book, like how you feel like you handle that issue? And both of you kind of generally like your thoughts on the nature of romance being a guaranteed happily ever after as a genre, just kind of like your general thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think Susie touched on it. Earlier, the beautiful thing about romance is that the guaranteed HEA, happily ever after, kind of provides a safe place to land for readers, where no matter the roller coaster, we're going to land safely. But I also think it presents a unique challenge for authors as to how do I keep this story compelling? How do I motivate the reader to keep going through it? And how do I make this a page turner? And that is where my good friend angst comes in. And mess. I love mess. I think between the three of us, we're fans of messy situations. And so particularly in this book, which is a second chance romance, we've got some dual timeline where we're moving back and forth. The question is, like, clearly when Danny walks into Kalia's reception area and they see each other for the first time after 7 years, it's like this whoa shock to the system. You know something happened, but you don't know what happened. And you see him kind of trying to win back her trust, but as a reader, you're like, well, what did he do? And is it worth forgiving? And so you kind of, as an author, I was trying to play with that unknown. And then you have to sort of decide, when do you reveal that moment? When do you go back and show what happened? And then how do you show that both of them actually grew, they changed, and now this love makes sense. And I think that's the challenge of a second chance romance. It didn't work before. What makes it right again? And then we have the dreaded third act breakup, which I will always defend. Because real life relationships are messy. And so the question then becomes, they're gonna end up together, but how? How are we gonna get these people together after everything that we've put them through, or I've put them through as the author? So I think that's where the justification for the HEA comes from, is we have to get them there.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said, Myah. I think there's so much that you can still be surprised by, even if you know what the ending is going to be. And also there's some room to play with the ending as well. I'm really interested in, I think a lot about queer happy endings, but I think it's also like, as romance generally becomes more inclusive and more diverse, You know, for a long time, the romance genre has like a very standard epilogue happy ending. It's like, oh, here's this couple, they're married, they're having babies, they bought a house, there's a white picket fence, everything's perfect for them. And it's a very like white, straight idea of what a good life looks like. And I'm really interested in how, as we start to see more diverse voices in the romance space, like how does that change? Like, is a good life for everyone like that, or what can a happy ending look like? So I think there's room within the story to build suspense of how they get there, and there's also room to surprise you with what that good life looks like for the characters when they get there at the end.
Awesome. All right, again.
I think you went red.
I did. All right, I'm gonna have to share one of you guys. All right, Susie, you again like went into my next subject. No, it's great. The transitions are fantastic. So I want to talk about writing marginalized characters in romance because historically romance has been a very white genre, white, straight, cis, het genre. Why do you think that, or I guess my question is more like, do you think it's very important to portray marginalized characters in this genre in particular? Could you speak to the importance of doing that and how you approach doing that with authenticity in your own writing?
Absolutely. I think it all comes back to something I was saying earlier about this promise of the happy ending for your characters, and that like even messy characters deserve love, but I think it also showing the complicated journeys that diverse and like different queer and characters of color and disabled characters and all of these different experiences, showing that no matter where you come from, you do deserve to be loved and you deserve to find love. And I think that that's something that's really powerful, but also having happy stories about like diverse characters, because for so long traditional publishing was only interested in stories that were tragic. Like queer characters, like sometimes for a long time in publishing, you could not publish a queer story that didn't end with one of the characters dying or having some kind of terrible ending, because otherwise you're teaching people that being queer is okay, God forbid. So I think that romance has this incredible power to show people being happy. Like my first book is set in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is where I met my spouse. And I think it's, when you think about a queer story in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you're not necessarily picturing somebody with like a strong queer community and finding love and finding a happy ending. But I think that it's really powerful to be able to see that, and it also to be a fun experience reading it is something that's different and new in publishing. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be so new.
Yeah.
What do you think, Myah?
I think, yeah, I agree with everything you just said, and I think love and falling in love is just, plainly put, is a common aspect of the human condition. However, for time immemorial, media depictions in television, books, film, screen, music, media depictions, like you said, have been predominantly heteronormative, white, cis, gendered, and I think that it was Roger Ebert who said movies are the most powerful aid to empathy. I think books as well, because you're stepping inside someone else's shoes. And so I'm a firm believer in that telling stories with characters who look different than you, believe different than you, come from a different background from you, aid to empathy. So I think it's important to engage in media that showcases different walks of life and showcases different people, because it aids in your empathy. And maybe if you can be invested in someone else's love story, you can be invested in their happiness in just everyday life, and then that can bleed into the rest of the way that you live your life. And so, I mean, that might be a little bit macro, but I mean, for an example I like to use, I used to be obsessed with the Bachelor franchise. And I started watching it when I was probably 11 years old, and for the next 10 years, I didn't see a lead of color. And so I was invested in these love stories of people who didn't look like me. And I think that can be a problem. And so when we are able to have our stories told, and people who don't look like us are invested in our stories, I think that's a good thing. So
Yeah, I totally agree. Have you, and this is a little, behind the scenes, have either of you experienced issues writing these books and getting these books published? Like, what has your experience been in publishing, writing about marginalized characters?
Sure. I will say that for my publishing journey, getting to the point of drafting this manuscript, finding a literary agent, getting a book deal, I feel incredibly fortunate. I know that it was a combination of, preparation and, and luck. So I haven't faced challenges and I know my story is not the story of many, and because then all of the lists would be different, and the bookshelves at bookstores would be different. I think it's more on the back end, on, not just, retail placement and consumer patterns, but when you walk into Target and you look at the romance shelves and you see 2 Black romances and 25 others, that is something that, the visibility, or if just because of life, that when you walk into a bookstore and you see a book cover with 2 Black people on the cover, it's more likely that book's gonna get passed over. So I think, it's just sort of interrogating what our habits are and what our expectations are and what our tastes are, and just kind of expanding our horizons. So I would say that's been my experience, that on the sales side, I definitely notice a difference.
Yeah. I totally agree with all of that. I think also, my experience was also a lot easier than many other romance authors that I've talked to. And I think part of that is because of readers, like people like you who show up and are excited about diverse romances and like go to your bookstores and ask for them, because that shows publishing and the rest of the book industry that people want these stories, and that clears a pathway that makes it a little bit easier for those of us who are trying to write them. In my case, I think like one of the first and hardest notes that I got from my editor on my very first book was, okay, this is a great book. We need to open the door to welcome in straight readers so that they feel comfortable here and that they can understand and appreciate the story. And I was like, okay, I don't know how to read a book like a straight person, so I don't know what that means. What do you want here? What? So, we had some conversations. Luckily, I do have a queer editor, so she was able to kind of we talked through it together. But that's not something that you want to hear about your stories. Nobody's going to want to read this except for people who are already queer. And I think that that's also a note that I hope people don't get in the future, because I hope that as readers, a big tool of reading is empathy, like you're talking about. And it's the ability to put yourself in different shoes. And so I think that that is hopefully also changing. That was several years ago at this point. But it also, I went to Oklahoma for my second book that came out this year, and I met somebody who had read my first book, and she was so lovely. She's like, this is my favorite book in the whole world. I am a lesbian in Oklahoma, and I've never seen my experience in a book like this, and it is incredible. Thank you so much for writing. And I was in tears, because I'm oh my God, this is, no matter all the trouble and everything that I've been through, that one moment makes it all worth it.
That's fantastic, and I'm just listening to you guys and just empathizing quite a bit. You answered my next question. No, we're like this, Susie. So I was going to ask you about reader responses to your books, and what have been some of the best responses? You just gave us an example, and also the most surprising response to your book. When you wrote, I know when I wrote my book, some of the responses, I was fascinated about how people read my characters and how people perceived my story and what they took away from it. So can you share some of the responses that just thrilled you or surprised you?
Honestly, the first 5-star reviews that weren't from people who grew up with me or were related to me, frankly, literally floored me. That someone who doesn't know me and is not invested in my emotional well-being read this and thought enough of it to give it a 5-star review shocked me. But also, I've had the opportunity to take meetings with people who, this is a book about the film industry, and I've had the opportunity to have meetings with people in the film industry about this book, and a lot of them Black women who are producers or writers or actors who've read this book and connected with it, and the number of them who've looked me in the eye and said, I felt like you were writing my story. And because in my experience, writing Kalia's story was like writing my own, I really felt alone. And the fact that these are people whose work I admire and look up to and looked at me and said, this story felt like you were writing my story, was just like, I mean, I get chills even just thinking about it. So the fact that, you know, you can find that universal experience, I think it was James Baldwin who said, you feel like, you know, you're the only person going through something until you read. That's a horrible, you know, bastardization of that quote.
I think
I'm sorry.
it's pretty good.
Yeah, but basically the point is reading lets you know that your experiences that make you feel so isolated are really universal. And so that was one of those moments for me.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because I also try to stay away from. Do you go on Goodreads?
Unfortunately, yes.
Oh my God, you're so brave.
I know. I'm a little bit of a like, what is it, masochist?
Yeah. Do you go on Goodreads, Regina?
Okay, so I filter my Goodreads.
Okay,
I do
that's
not
smart.
just go in like so I go to Goodreads and only look at 5 to 4.
That's so smart.
I look at the 1 stars just to see like, is there anything in here I can glean
No.
from this?
The answer is no.
It's
No.
usually no.
Look, like you can never write a book that universally will be loved because everybody has different tastes. So like I get that. That's why I don't go. I do ask my wife to occasionally go on and tell me only the good things. I similarly filter, but like through a human. However, it's probably less reliable than how you do it because my wife will be like, this person is wrong on the internet. I have to tell you about this 1 star. I'm like, explicitly what I told you I did not want to hear. She's like, but they're wrong. Okay. But like some people complained about my first book that it's set in like 2013 Oklahoma and there's a non-binary like friend in the group, and I saw some reviews where people were like, that's not true. Nobody was non-binary in 2013. No, that's not, no, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. I lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2013, and I could tell you that's not how it works. So I think part of it is like, I hope that that person then had to think about that and consider it, and I didn't respond, obviously, because I don't want them
You
to
can never respond.
never respond. But I also, you know, I have some readers that read it who maybe like are not really represented in the book who will come up to me and be like, oh my God, I learned so much. Like, can I ask you questions about queer identity and all these things? And I'm not necessarily like a professional, you know, gender theory to explain these things to people, but to be able to have relatable characters and to have that kind of spark an idea and an interest in people to go seek out more information is really special.
Awesome. Okay.
Did I ruin the next question?
No, you did not. No. So we're gonna go into, I mean, I consider this like the really fun part of the conversation. We're gonna go into like romance stuff, like romance genre tropes, that sort of thing. What are your favorite romance tropes to write and why? And then also, what are your favorite to read and why?
I like Second Chance just because, again, angst. I just feel like it's built in because obviously these people broke up, and you know, I always like having someone have to grovel and prove themselves worthy of forgiveness. I'm into this whole celebrity normie thing just because it's just like, I think in real life, whenever a celebrity is like dating a normal person, and I don't know, I loved romantic comedy, the Curtis Sittenfeld book. I don't know if you guys read it. I listened to the audio more times than I would like to admit. But I don't know, something about it just feels like kind of voyeuristic and like cool. So I have a fun time writing, and that's kind of what When I Think of You is, and reading those a lot. And also I live in LA, so it just kind of feels adjacent to my, yeah.
Okay. I am not a super trope-driven writer. Like, it's not really the place that I start from, and then sometimes my publishing team tries to like force in some tropes for selling and having those keywords. My third book is actually Second Chance Romance, and it was really fun reading Myah's book because she nailed it, and it's also an incredibly hard trope to write. If you love Second Chance Romance, you need to thank your authors of those books that you like, because you have to believe that this couple loved each other before, you have to understand that there was a good reason that they broke up, you have to understand why they want to come back together now, and like what growth has happened to bring them back together that you agree with it. So like you have to see so many sides of it, and you have to take them on that journey very carefully, and you did such a good job in When I Think of You. I love reading Enemies to Lovers. I think that it's really fun because it's such a big emotional journey of going from like really hating someone to really loving someone. And I love that tension of being like, oh, I hate them, but they're hot. Like, I just think that's good. But for the most part, I think my first two books are a little more in that like kind of 90s, early 2000s rom-coms of just like a little bit wacky. I guess my genre is plucky young lesbian finds herself in a pickle. So just whatever drama gets them there, I guess.
Second Chance is my favorite too, and it's my next book is Second Chance. So everything you were talking about, I'm like, yes, it's hard, yes.
And it's so worth it when it
It
works.
is worth it. Like, make me cry, devastate me, and then put me back together. That's Second Chance. All right. Okay. How do you subvert or play with tropes in your writing? And, even, I know, Susie, you talked about that you're not trope forward, but tropes pop up in different places. So how do you play with them, subvert them, to kind of make them feel fresh for your readers when they're reading?
I'm not sure I do, but I will say that I did have one, as I was querying agents, so pitching this manuscript to agents, I did have one get back to me and say, Hollywood is kind of overdone, and I just don't think the stakes here are high enough to break this out of the pack. And I was like, well, do I need to add murder? I don't really know what that means, but I also feel like when people say, tropes are overdone, I get a little annoyed by that because I'm like, but how many Black Hollywood romances is traditional publishing? So I'm like, when you want to talk about marginalized voices, let us give our crack at them before we decide that they're played out. There have been a lot of witchy rom-coms, but how many queer witchy rom-coms or how many disabled witchy rom-coms have we seen? So I mean, I don't want to say that's subverting the trope, but I do think that we need to give other perspectives on the tropes. So let us have our take at them before we decide if they're played out. So.
Absolutely. I love a little tongue-in-cheek moment with a trope where you're kind of making a nod to how you recognize that this can be considered overdone, and that can make it even more fun sometimes. Yeah, I don't know that I have a better answer than you already did.
I will say that, I don't know if this is answering that, but I will say the fake dating trope sometimes gets to me because I don't ever really believe the reason why they have to fake date. Will your great aunt really write you out of the will if you don't have a girlfriend by the time you're 32? I just don't, I feel like we need to find better reasons, so maybe I'll take that challenge on one day.
I love that, but I also sometimes the more convoluted the better. If it's the most ridiculous premise for why they have to have a fake relationship, then I'm like, okay.
I think insurance fraud is probably the most believable one.
Honestly, when it comes to marriages of convenience and fake dating and contemporaries, I think more of them would make more sense if their motivations were just selfish. I'm fake dating because I want this job and I'm gonna get it. Instead of oh, she'll write me out of the well, and then you kind of go down. It's just more no, I'm lazy and this is a quick way to do it.
Or the latest Emily Henry funny story where it's they both got dumped and they're just we're sad sacks and let's just pretend that we're dating because that's believable.
We make terrible choices. Okay. Okay, romance generally as a genre has exploded in popularity recently. It's always been, we all know that it's the genre that what do they say? They keeps publishing afloat. It makes so much money, but here recently, the New York Times bestseller list, all the bestseller lists have been filled with romance novels. Why do you think that is? And what keeps you coming back to this genre as a writer?
My mom is in the audience today. Hello, Mom. My mom is a romance reader, and I grew up stealing her books and reading them when I was too young to be reading romance novels. But I have been a lifelong romance novel fan, and I think that it's something about that comfort of knowing that it really is nice to go into a book not afraid that the character you love is going to die in the end. I think there's also the reason, romance has always been a huge genre. It has always been one of the best-selling genres that keeps the book industry afloat, but they haven't always talked about it is the problem. And I think part of that is because romance readership is mostly women. And so publishing says, oh, women read it, it's frivolous, it doesn't matter, it's embarrassing, we don't talk about it. And I think we're finally reaching a moment where we're saying just because something is fun and feels good to read doesn't mean that it's not worthy of time. And in fact, forget you, I'm gonna do something that feels good. It's the year 2024. If something makes me happy and smile, then I'm gonna do it. So I think that's part of what's driving it, and I've always been a fan. I also, I think the cute cartoon covers have also changed the industry a lot. Love them or hate them, people used to not want to hold a book with like a bare chest on the front and like the clinch in a public space. And like number one, we're hopefully starting to move past that embarrassment of loving romance. And number two, this makes it a little less awkward if you like see your grandparents while you're out reading this book.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, romance readers are voracious, and romance writers are prolific, not present company not included. So I think just the supply and demand is you know, just a practical reason for that, but also I think there's always going to be an appetite for romance stories regardless of the medium, and we're not getting those amazing rom-coms that we had in the 90s and the early aughts anymore. And so, you know, books are here to provide that for people, and I think Hollywood is starting to catch up by adapting a lot, optioning a lot to adapt. If you haven't seen Nobody Wants This on Netflix, I've been watching it in my hotel room at night. It's really fun. It's like that Keeping the Faith movie. It reminds me of that. So I think that romance novels are kind of feeding an appetite out there for romance stories. And again, like you said, it's a comfort. You know, it's providing comfort because there is that soft place to land, particularly in a post-pandemic society, or not post, but like we're kind of living this endemic pandemic thing, where people just want feel-good, happy endings.
That's fantastic. Okay, I'm going to slide in a question for both of you. It's a quick one that we haven't discussed in a minute. What is your, if you had someone approach you that was new to this genre and you wanted to recommend them one book to kind of get them hooked on this genre, what would that book be?
I mean, I say it's gonna be Kennedy Ryan. you were gonna know that, but now I have to pick which Kennedy Ryan. Okay, I'm gonna say Real by Kennedy Ryan. I don't think you can go wrong with that book. A runner-up would be Before I Let Go.
That's a good answer. I will say the one that got me hooked in like a more contemporary romance genre, Jasmine Guillory. I love Jasmine Guillory, and The Wedding Date was kind of like the first one. I was like, oh, like maybe I could, like maybe I want to do more of this. Maybe I want to like be in this space too. Like this is such a fun place to play around. So Jasmine Guillory is great. I was thinking like a queer romance space. Not an original answer, but Casey McQuiston. Red, White, and Royal Blue is just like so juicy and dramatic and fun, and I mean, it got a lot of people hooked. I think I wouldn't have gotten a book deal in the first place if Casey McQuiston hadn't written that book and kind of opened up the world of queer romance.
All right, I'm going to add mine. I would say 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, and one of the reasons is because I think it's a great transition book. It is right in that midpoint between kind of a more like upmarket book club literary book and romance, and it really, when I read it, it really made me go, this is what romance can do. We can do this in romance, and I think it's a great gateway drug to romance. So, 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. All right, can both of you tell us what is up next to you? Tell us about your upcoming projects, and are there any themes or characters you're particularly excited to explore next? So talk to us about your next book, and maybe talk to us about beyond that, what you would like to play around with as far as characters, themes, genres go.
My next book, No Ordinary Love, title inspired by the Sade song, comes out April 1st, 2025, and it is the story of an R&B pop princess recording artist, loosely inspired by Myah Ariel, and she is going through a tumultuous divorce with her record-producing ex-husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, but she ends up falling for a baseball player, baseball bad boy, LA Dodger pitcher. So it's very like soapy, juicy, celebrity romance, and I'm really excited about this book. And there are a lot of themes, a woman finding her independence after heartbreak, falling in love, not wanting to lose herself, in a male-dominated industry, trying to assert herself. A lot of the same things of when I think of you, a little bit more mature, a little bit more grown up. And so that's my next book, very excited about it. And I think I want to just continue pulling on those same themes. I like to say that my brand is R&B kind of love, because I'm so inspired by music. And I also really want to tell stories about Black women who are challenged in their careers, but also challenged in love as well. And so whether it's, you know, Black women in medicine, Black women in academia, I kind of want to continue to spotlight strong Black women who are strong in their careers, but also trying to find love. So that's it in a nutshell.
I want to read that book so bad.
Yes.
I'm very excited. So I have not officially announced my next book. I can't tell you too much about it, but I can give a little bit of a sneak preview. It'll come out next year, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about it soon. But it's set in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, which I'm very excited about because I love Eureka Springs. And as I mentioned, it's a second chance romance. It's a couple who had gotten together pretty young. They got a bed and breakfast. It all fell apart when it got successful, and their career ambitions diverged. But now they've kind of both landed back there, not expecting the other one to be there, and chaos ensues. So I'm very excited to have my home state as part of my next book. That's something that I haven't done yet, but have been looking for the right story for it. One of the themes in a second chance romance too, I think is interesting is so many romances really focus on that early honeymoon phase of the meet cute, and then you have all this good feels, and you're yeah, we love each other, cool, at the end. But I think it's also really fun in romance to explore the realities of actually loving someone for a long portion of their lives and growing and changing together, and how you figure out how to make that work. So that's something that I'm excited about in that book. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, thank you both. I think at this point we're going to open it up to audience questions. So if any of you have any questions you'd like to ask our authors.
While you think on questions, Regina, can you tell us about your next book?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, my next book comes out next summer, and it's called August Lane, and it is about a washed-up one-hit wonder Black country musician who gets a second chance at stardom, but in order to realize his second chance at stardom, he has to return back to his small Arkansas hometown. But what people don't realize is that he lied about writing his most famous song. He did not write it, and the person who actually wrote it is a girl that he fell in love with in high school who still lives in that Arkansas small town, and he has to go face a big old reckoning, and he still has all kinds of feelings for her. So, it's called
Love it.
August Lane. It's coming out next July.
You had mentioned about the cartoon covers, and I see a lot of, not a lot, but some talk where people, and I think it's kind of the reader's fault, they see a cartoon cover and assume that it's vanilla or young adult, but I see yours, and I think it looks adult and fun. And when I think of you, it's just beautiful flowers. How do you think about that, or now do you have to think about that? How people will interpret your books just based on the cover? Because I know I see a lot of reviews for your book, and people were like, "I saw that cover and I just picked it up. I didn't care what it was about. I just needed to have a book that pretty on my shelf." Is that something you think about now, or do you like acting?
Yes.
And your cover is beautiful
Yeah.
too, and nobody
Not
thinks,
cartoon,
you
yeah.
know, think
Yeah.
it's for children.
I mean, the cover question touches on a lot of things that particularly as marginalized authors go through with our publishers, because we don't get the final say on our covers, but I think, I know, just because I know Regina, we are very vocal, and I'm assuming you were vocal in your cover process as well. I made a whole Pinterest board. I mean, down to the hair texture, the skin complexion, the hair color, the pose. I gave them fan cast for what, these are, in my head, this is what the actors that these characters look like. Please try to get close. Because I know that, like I said, when you go into a bookstore, you're not seeing a lot of Black characters represented on book covers. So for the very few that you're going to see, I want there to be representation. So yeah.
I can talk about that too.
You went.
No, you go first.
Yes, we definitely don't get total control over what happens. And I have complicated feelings about the cartoon covers, they're cute, but I do think sometimes it's misleading of oh, if you're getting a really steamy romance, that's not what you thought you were gonna get. But I do think that romance readers are starting to adjust to it, but it also it's probably a trend. Everything in book covers is always a trend, and it'll probably change again in another decade or so. I don't know how long we've been doing this cartoon cover thing. Feels like about a decade. I think that the more you work with your cover designer and try and be vocal, like we get a better product for it. Like I find when I send in all these pictures and I get very specific about what the characters look like and feel like and what I want the vibe to be. Sometimes, like for my next book, I was very specific, like this is exactly how I picture the cover, and they didn't do that. But it still was a very beautiful, dynamic cover, I think because I provided so much detail and inspiration that they were like, okay, we don't want to do it exactly like you said, but we'll take pieces of that. And I think some authors are just like, here's the book, you take it from here, which I can't imagine because I'm a control freak, but yeah.
And I just wanted to speak on it because mine is different, so I didn't have an illustrated cover, I'm not going to have one for the second one either. And one thing I really learned when we got into publishing is that these are ads. That's what the covers are, and that's how they're treated by the publishers, that they're ads for the book. And a lot of times the choice of your cover, when we say we don't have control over the choice of the cover, it's more like that book is being packaged by our publisher in order to appeal to the type of reader that they think will pick it up. And so it's not, a lot of times, it really isn't a complete reflection of what's in the book. It's more a reflection of who they think that book's readers are. So if, you know, like an illustrated cover, they want people who pick up illustrated covers to look at that book. My book is not going to have an illustrated cover. Like, I couldn't get one if I asked for it because my publisher is the same imprint that publishes Kennedy Ryan and Tia Williams, and they don't have illustrated covers. So I was never going to get an illustrated cover because they want those readers to pick up my book as well. So a lot of the lack of control comes from, this is an ad and we need to target readers. Where our control comes in is when they come to me and says, okay, this is the kind of cover you're going to get. I get to point out things that are egregious. Like my next book is set in summer in August in Arkansas, and it gave me pictures of people wearing scarves. And I said, try again. So we absolutely do get a voice, but it really helped me when I realized what work the cover is actually doing.
Yeah, I just dovetailing off of that to emphasize what she's saying. So she's at the imprint with Tia Williams and Kennedy. I'm at the imprint with Emily Henry and Carly Fortune and Allie Hazelwood. So cartoon covers. And so I knew, and when they asked me for cover comps for like my dream cover, I sent them Tia Williams, 7 Days in June, which is not an illustrated cover. And I said, if it's not this, I don't want it. And they very quickly sent me back artists that were illustrators. And so I had to swallow down the fact that I was going to have an illustrated cover. But if I was going to have an illustrated cover, I think I got the most beautiful depiction of, you know, illustration that I could, and I wanted them to look like real people. I wanted there to be brush strokes so that it would look like a painting. And so my agency came in where they sent me artist portfolios, and I was able to pick the artist whose, you know, their style fit what I was looking for. So there are ways around this.
See what I know?
You kind of were talking about it a little bit with how much choice you have with the covers, but kind of like back in the beginning days when y'all were starting out, Myah, I think you mentioned this a little early on, but when you're sending your manuscript to different agents and trying to get an agent and they're coming back with all that feedback, how do you determine, oh, this is a good tip, let me use it, or not? Like, is there a lot of self-doubt? Like, how do you make those decisions before you actually have that agent and publisher?
Yeah, I mean, so there were tears because like it's a very vulnerable place to be in to like send your book out, and a lot of agents don't give you feedback. They reject and say this isn't for me, wishing you the best of luck. The only time, and that the feedback I mentioned before was a rejection, and so I think it was, you told me a couple years ago, it was like, if it doesn't resonate, just leave it. Which is really good advice because my agent, who's my current agent, she rejected me, but she gave me feedback that resonated. And it was 3 notes that she gave me, and for lack of time, I won't say what they were. But when I read them, I was like, you know what, I think you're right. And so I took that and I wrote her back and I said, if I revise this, would you look at it again? And she said yes. And I spent a summer working on it, and I sent it back to her, and she offered within like a week. So I think it's just like, you kind of have to go with that gut feeling. Like, I knew the agent who said, your stakes aren't high enough for this to bring, like, that just didn't resonate with me. I was just kind of like, okay. But like the other, and I think that's just kind of like the kismet of this all. It's like sometimes, like, this is the right agent for me because her feedback resonated, and that wasn't the right agent because she just, something in here just wasn't right. So you kind of just have to go with your intuition a little bit.
Yeah. It's really interesting, the process of writing a book before you have an agent and an editor versus after, because before it's like this very safe thing that you can take all your time in the world, you can make it anything that you want it to be, you really get to shape it however you want. And once you have kind of started working with someone, you lose a little bit of that control. And often, like, by the time you have a book deal and you have an editor, it's like you can't, there are some things you can't tell them no about because they're the one paying you and they get to be like, okay, if you're not doing it, then bye, it's over. So I think it's important to work with people that you do really trust and you feel like get what you're trying to do. I know that I talked with several different agents who made offers of representation with my first book, and it was a really good opportunity to think through, like, okay, what feedback is this person giving me? What's their vision for the book? Does it align with mine? Does it not? And it's really important in publishing, I think, to work with people that you can really trust. And once you do, it's great, because even if, when you get feedback, even if it's somebody telling you that there are things that they don't like about the book, you know that you both want it to kind of be the same thing in the end, and you both want it to do as well as it can. So it's easier to take feedback from somebody that you trust because you can say, okay, even if I don't like this note, I don't agree with this note, but what are they getting at? Like, does it mean that there's the emotional journey for the reader is not hitting what I want to hit? So how can I go about having that emotional beat in a different way than they're suggesting? And I think it's always an interesting journey because I've heard advice that, like, you write the first draft of a book for yourself, you write the second draft of a book for your editor, and then you write the third draft of the book for everyone. So you really are changing your perspective on what this story is supposed to do as that journey goes through.
Quickly, I have two things. One, don't ever take feedback or advice from someone who doesn't like the type of stuff you write or the way you write it. Only take feedback from someone who is a fan of your voice and what the type of thing you're writing. Because then when they tell you something's not working, you know you're making changes that align with the person you actually want to read your book. So if someone's giving you feedback and they hate romance, please throw it in the trash, okay? The other thing, when it comes to publishing professionals generally, and I realized this after I gave you that advice, it's consistent with the gut feeling. Generally with feedback, when you're querying for agents, feedback is really only useful from people who have some sort of investment in your book. So if you get feedback from an agent that gives you a revise and resubmit is what we call it, where they're like, I like this, but I want to see if you can revise it in a way that I think I can sell it. That's a little bit of investment in your book. People who reject it and just say, yeah, I didn't like the character, they're not remotely invested in your book, you can throw that away. Same with editors. When you submit it for publication, editors who acquire your book give the best feedback because they are invested in its being successful. Editors who reject your book are not. So that's kind of the rule for whether to take feedback. Anyone have? Yeah.
So how did y'all just decide you wanted to write books?
I think ever since I was a kid, I just thought being an author sounded cool, and it also sounded really hard. And I think I've always been kind of like enticed by challenges. Like like years ago, 2014, I binged the Great British Bake Off on Netflix, and then I decided I wanted to start baking, and then I started baking. I just taught myself how to bake, and then I was making wedding cakes, and so I just think, I just thought, but then at the same time, I thought, like, who gets to become an author? Like, you have to know somebody, you have to have connections, like, how is that even possible? And then again, like, going back to the pandemic, we just, had more time on our hands. And I've always been a writer, but never creative. Like, I have a degree in journalism, I wrote film criticism, and so I've always felt comfortable in, like, exercising the muscle of writing, but creative writing was scary. Like, dialogue is scary to me. Recreating or creating conversations, creating characters was scary to me. And I felt like, this is, personal. I became a mom during the pandemic. It was a very challenging experience, and after that I was just like, I can do hard things. So writing a book, becoming an author, it's gonna be hard, but let's see if I can do it. And so that was just kind of it.
Yeah, I was always a voracious reader. I've always been very into books and grew up in Arkansas going into the CALS libraries. But being an author it felt like New York. Like there was a disconnect for me between like having the book in my hands that I loved and the person who wrote it. And I didn't really know what that journey looked like, and I didn't really see myself as somebody who could do that. I started writing about books for Book Riot primarily because I wanted publishers to send me books for free, which was successful. I highly recommend that. And then I started talking to people there who had written manuscripts, were looking for representation, people who had been published. I started to hear these journeys, and it started to feel more accessible as I started talking to people. And then I wrote my first draft of a novel, not expecting to do anything with it. I put it away. I was like, it's probably trash, but like, ooh, 50,000 words, that's cool. And then a few months later, I broke my leg really massively and had surgery. I couldn't like touch it to the ground for some months, and I was, what else am I doing? I might as well pull out this crappy book and see what happens. And it all kind of like fell together for me as a kind of a chance moment in my life. I think maybe it sounds like that was kind of the pandemic for you. That sometimes it's just the stars align. Sorry, astrology. But I'm very grateful that I went for it, and I think anybody here, if you are passionate about books and storytelling, but you think that you're too old or not experienced enough or anything like that, if you have a story that you want to tell, I really encourage you to try, because you may surprise yourself.
Great. I think we have time for one more question.
So, I have a question. So, when you're writing your book, sorry, I'm trying to get the words out. So, when writing your book, like, did you have any actresses or actors in mind? I know you mentioned like fan casting. So, if there was like a movie or a show about your book, like, who would the main character be? Because I think it's so interesting seeing different people's ideas of like who they think Leah would be or who Bray would be. So, who do you guys think would be those characters?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because my vision of Kalia was always DeWanda Wise, who is actually the narrator of the audiobook. So another one of those kind of like stars aligned moments, because that happened because my film agent actually sent her the book. She loved the book, and we met on Zoom, and I think the Britney Spears memoir had just come out, and Michelle Williams did the audiobook, and we were kind of just like joking about like, have you heard that audiobook? And we were like, wouldn't it be cool if you did mine? And so she is the voice of Kalia, and I always envisioned her as Kalia. And then I always saw Jesse Williams as Danny, but now I'm seeing Aaron Pierre. I don't know if you guys, we're seeing him everywhere, but I just think Rebel Ridge on Netflix, if you haven't seen it, but yeah, I see, his eyes are beautiful.
I've not historically fan cast my books. I tried it for my fourth book that I'm drafting now, and it's an interesting experience to go from that way. I think it kind of can help with dialogue to have a voice in your head at least. So not bad. Smart. Wow, who knew? And for my first book, because I wasn't planning to do anything with it, it was just my like fun little side project, I cast my friends in it, which means that also if their physical descriptions sound like people that are my friends, a lot of people are like, oh, this is your friend, this is their exact life story, everything about this is true. And it is absolutely not. I just kind of fan cast them physically, which created some problems for me. So I don't recommend that method at all. What about you, Regina?
Oh, I can't admit my fan casts out loud. So a lot of my fan casts are just like inappropriate. So in my head I'll cast a 40-year-old for a 26-year-old, and every time I say it, so I usually keep it to myself. But you are absolutely right. Like casting an actor really helps with voice and dialogue and helps make them real in your head. So yeah, I tend to not share mine because they're embarrassing.
I don't think it's embarrassing because you're fan casting. So you can be like, this person who's now 40, but I'm picturing them at 26.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah. That is exactly how it goes. It's like this actor, but this era of this actor.
But like, weren't all of the 90210 actors like 30?
They were, and that was embarrassing. All right, I think we're actually out of time. It's 12:30. Thank you both so much. This has been such a fun discussion. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
And thank you to the library for hosting this amazing event, and both the bookstores as well.
Thank you.